Let's settle this once and for all. Is it better to be an airline pilot or a corporate pilot? Hey guys, my name is Katie. I am a professional pilot and I work on the corporate side of the house, but I get asked this question all the time about why I went the corporate route. Is it better than the airlines? And what should people do if they're getting into flying right now? So I'm here to give you the no holds barred, true answer, all the ins and outs. I'm going to talk about pay. I'm going to give you all the pros and cons of both routes. And then I'm going to talk about all the job options as well and give you my answer about which one is better for you to choose as a career. And my answer might surprise you a little bit. So first of all, let's define these two things if you're not into aviation or maybe you're just getting into it in the beginning. So a corporate pilot is more the private jet side of the house. Airline pilots is obviously somebody that's flying for like Delta, United, all of these different options. This is kind of the standard route people think of when you say that you're a professional pilot, is that you must fly for one of these airlines. But a lot of other people don't know that there's this whole other corporate side of things, which involves two segments. So there's Part 135 and there's Part 91. Part 135 basically means they're chartering flights for the general public. So not someone that owns their own jet. It's the general public can call a company and say, hey, we want to take a private jet from A to B, and then they can charter a flight on that. That's Part 135. Part 91 is a family owns their own private jet and then they hire pilots to fly that. So there's different rules and regulations that cover each one, because one of them you're taking everybody from the general public, and then one of them it's basically just a family or their direct employees and so forth. So when I talk about corporate aviation, I'm just talking about that whole side of the house, but I will differentiate a couple times between Part 135 and Part 91 because that is important. Part 121 is what we call airlines. So now that we've got all the terms out of the way and all the weird lingo, let's move on to which one is better. So first off, we're going to get right into it and talk about pay. This might be the most important thing to you. So let's go right into it. In the beginning, to become an airline pilot, you have to have an airline transport pilot license, which basically means you have to have 1,500 total hours and a bunch of other sub requirements. Now, the first thing that people don't know about corporate aviation is you have to have those same licenses on that side as well. Sometimes you don't legally to fly a certain airplane, like for example in a Pilatus PC-12, which is a single engine turboprop that I fly, you don't have to have an ATP to operate that plane, but pretty much every company that you work for is going to want you to have the ATP. So that really is not a difference. You know, generally everywhere I've worked, they want you to have the ATP. I actually got a single engine ATP as my initial and then move forward from there. There are some options, like if you want to fly a TBM or a Pilatus, where they're not going to require the ATP, but in general, this is a misconception. Both sides of the house, if you're a professional pilot, you pretty much all have 1,500 hours, you pretty much all have all the ATPs and the different ratings, so that's really not much of a differentiation. But on the pay side of the house, there is generally quite a bit of difference. So airlines have a set scale. It's sort of like being in the military where you have a rank and you make X amount of money based off that rank and your time in service. So if you were to start at a regional airline, you would probably be making $90,000 to $100,000 right now, year one. So this is after you've built 1,500 hours, you've gotten hired by a regional, which is somebody like SkyWest, Horizon. And a lot of the times these look just like an Alaska plane or a Delta plane to the general public. They're having that livery or that paint on the airplane, but it's a completely different company that's operating those shorter routes or different routes. It's not the actual legacy airline. So year one FO pay, you're starting about 90 to 100. This is obviously depending on how much you fly, your hours and things like that. But then it moves on. So let's say the top of your career, you're at, 64 years old, because as an airline pilot under 121, you can only work up to 65 years old. This is a loss. You have to retire at 65. You're going to make, $300,000, $400,000 a year, and you're really not going to work very much. I know some airline pilots at that point in their career that I know personally, they work once a month and they're making $400K. Now, obviously, this is the end of their career, and you got to keep in mind, for the first 15 or 20 years of their career, they were gone on Christmas. They were gone, on kids' birthdays and things like that. But at the end, it's pretty good money for not a whole lot of labor, which is kind of what we want to look at, is I'm trading you my time for money. So it's a pretty good exchange there. Now, on the corporate side of the house, there's a lot more variety. So it really just depends on where you work. But the pay range is generally going to be much lower than that. So you have a lot more flexibility on this side where you can kind of make your pay what you want it in a sense. You can contract, you can job shop, all these different things. But in general, it is going to be less. You know, you're still making a decent living wage. Like, let's be very clear. You're generally going to be starting at like 100 and then maybe go to like 250, 300,000 on the corporate side. So like, still a lot of money to be made as a pilot. And this is obviously, we're talking over the course of an entire career, but in general, the airlines are going to pay more. Next up, I want to talk about the type of airplanes that you're going to be flying. This is important to a lot of pilots. Some people just want to fly that big iron and that matters to them. And I get it. We're pilots, we're nerdy, we love certain things. Maybe you've been dreaming your whole life to get into like a 747 or an Airbus, and that's really important to you. Although you probably missed the boat on the 747, the Airbus is still an option. So if you really have it as a big priority that you want to fly that big iron, you're going to probably want to go to an airline. That's consistently going to be something that you're definitely going to be able to get into. And on the corporate side of the house, you're flying more business jets. So sometimes we kind of joke and call it like a Barbie jet because it is. It's smaller. It's not like a jet you can stand up in all the time. Although on the business side, there are quite a few like that as well. It just really depends on where you want to go airframe wise. Some people on the business side, they're like, I want to fly a Gulfstream. This is like a big priority to me. And that definitely happens. They have a great pay, they have a great schedule, they have a great quality of life, and they fly a big old plane that they can stand up on. And it's beautiful, you know, like we're talking the best of the best. So that's just something to consider. That's not really like one's better, one's worse. It's just different options. If that really matters to you, then you got to pick and choose. To me, that doesn't really matter. I like flying a Pilatus. I like flying the Citation. I like flying a Cessna 172. I like flying a Piper Cub. If you were to pay me X amount of dollars a year that paid my mortgage to fly a Piper Cub, I'd probably do it and just be super happy. So not a big deal to me, but to some people, they really want that certain type rating. They really want to fly a certain airplane. So you got to consider that when you're picking between the two. Okay, next up, we're going to get into a general overall list of pros and cons for each side. I may miss some, so if I do, I would love to hear what you think and put it in the comments section because I'm sure I missed something, and some of you guys on the airline side or the corporate side are gonna think of something. I know it. So right off the bat, we talked about pay. We've already covered that. In general, the airlines are going to be higher overall than the corporate side of the house. We've talked about airframes, not really a pro or con, but it could be for you if you have a certain airplane you really want to fly. Now let's talk about additional duties. So what are we doing other than just flying the airplane? Is there anything on the airline side that involves? Now, obviously on both sides of the house, you have to go to your training every year to maintain your type ratings. So that's on both sides of the house, although in the corporate side, you may have to go to multiple. Now, again, this might be a pro for you or it might be a con. If you really want to have multiple type ratings, that's cool to you. This could matter, but on the airline side of the house, you're going to go to your recurrent and you're going to go to your initial, and you just have to do that every year as well as the corporate side. So that's one additional duty. The other thing on the corporate side is we do stock the ice on the airplane, we stock the coffee, we stock the snacks sometimes. Now, this is not every company. Some companies have people that do this for them, so it just really depends. If you're not aware, on the corporate side, like I said, there's a ton of variety. There's companies like NetJets and FlexJet, which are almost like a mini airline, but just under corporate rules and for private jets because they're large, they still have a dispatch, they have a lot of people that do all those additional duties for you. So this is kind of like a mix of the two. And then there's like companies that I work for where our flight department's just 2 people. We kind of do all the additional stuff. And that's what I prefer and I'm very happy with. But that is kind of something to keep in mind as well, is it really depends on what company you work for on the corporate side. But I'm going to be totally honest with you. I have done a lab service on our Pilatus multiple times. Doesn't really bother me. I have stocked ice and coffee. Doesn't really bother me. I have washed the airplane. Doesn't really bother me. And the reason for that is because I do work at a good company with a great overall quality of life. Now, I have worked at some other companies where the schedule was much harder, and then they're also asking us to do these additional duties like come in and wing walk the airplanes out of the hangar because we had a lot of hangar rash. And when you're like, I am on, day 7 of 14 hours, that's just like gonna put you over the edge, So there's things like that you have to be aware of that do exist on the corporate side of the house. You may also have to go to company-wide meetings depending on where you work. You may be part of like a corporate America type company and be involved in things like that. Who knows? If you're kind of getting the gist of it by now, there is a lot of variety on the corporate side. Now, on the airline pilot side of the house, when you come home from work, you're done. Like, that's about it. So if that's important to you as well, you may want to think about that. Okay, next up in our pros and cons list is something that we all hate. It's the nasty F word, and it is furloughs. Okay, so on the airline side of the house, it's kind of one of those things that everybody says throughout the course of your career, you are going to get furloughed at least once. And we've seen this happen. You know, we're in the biggest pilot shortage of all time, but there are pilots right now that are on furlough from large airlines. Now, on the corporate side of the house, I have personally found there is a lot more job security. What I mean by this is like during 2020, when a lot of the airline and the flying jobs kind of stopped, people went to the corporate side because that was still running. Actually, corporate flying increased by 40% during that time in history because if people had the means, they were going to put themselves on a little private jet that had been sanitized rather than with the great unwashed masses. Corporate side, which could include like medevac flying, all these other things. This is kind of what I'm lumping into one whole category. That kind of runs and there's job options and there's stuff like that going a lot of the time. The airlines are very economic dependent. And so the furlough piece of the house is kind of a negative on the airline side, and there tends to be more stability on the corporate side. Next up, let's talk about life on the road. So if you can't tell right now, I'm in a hotel room, which is very rare for me. This is probably one of 2 nights away that I'm going to spend in a 3-month period. So like I said, the corporate side has a lot of variety. However, if being home at night is really important to you, you're going to go more towards the corporate side of the house. The airline pilot schedule is 3 on, 3 off, 4 on, 4 off for the duration. Okay, so while there's a lot of variety to that as well, you can bid reserve, you can live in base, and I know there's a lot of pilots that have had months at a time off and still getting paid their basic minimum. Like, this in general is going to be better on the corporate side depending on where you pick to work. So for example, if you work somewhere like FlexJet or NetJets, it's kind of like an airline schedule as well. You may do like a 7 on, 7 off. And at that point, I don't really see much of a difference. If you're going to be 7 on, 7 off, then why not work at an airline where you're going to get paid more and you can drop a trip and you have more reserve and all this other stuff. I don't know. So just my personal opinion on that one, but there are jobs on the corporate side of the house that you can find where you are home at night. And if that's really important to you, while they are much harder to find, that exists on the corporate side, and it really does not exist on the airline side unless you work in the training department or something like that. But we're kind of not talking about that because everybody here can get a sim instructor job and be home at night if that's something you choose to do. We're kind of leaving that out of the equation for now. The other part of life on the road, though, is like the quality of life on the road. So maybe from an airline stance, at least at the regional point, you might not be eating as well because you can't expense your food. So that's something that on the corporate side of the house, we have a company credit card. We pay for food and things like that on the road. So, if we are in an area where it's we're in a city and it's expensive, we're not going to go wild. Obviously, that's unethical, but we're going to pay for what we need to eat, and we can buy a salad or we can buy whatever. We really don't worry about it because this is just the cost of doing business. We also are, put in hotels that are nice. We're staying in areas that people want to go to, whether it's near where they're vacationing to or whatever the case may be. So on the road, you're going to have a rental car as a private corporate pilot. So everywhere you go, you're going to be getting a rental car. It's expensed, and that's a really nice thing, especially like if you're in training and you're staying there for a long time. If you're at 3.5 weeks at training, you're going to have a rental car. So you can go to a gym, you can go, to a beach, you can go take a walk somewhere and have a really significant quality of life. You can drive to a grocery store and stock your fridge with fruits and vegetables and have that be a better quality of life in training. Airline pilots don't get rental cars. They're taking a crew van to the hotel. They're eating whatever they can find. Obviously, a lot of people will meal prep, and if they're making enough money, who cares? Some of them, they're just going to buy the nice steak or the salad or whatever, and it really doesn't bother them. But if you're lower on the totem pole and you're trying to kind of get through that trip without spending a lot of money, that might be a concern for you. So I find quality of life on the road as a corporate pilot is probably better because of things like rental cars and being able to expense food and locations that you fly to. All right, next up in our pros and cons is variety of flying. So if you have ever heard an airline pilot, they kind of joke and say that they're a bus driver. And on the corporate pilot side of the house, that's not really the case. So I've flown into backcountry strips in Idaho. I have flown into big cities. I have flown into beautiful little mountain towns. I've flown into private airstrips for a private wedding. You know, things like that is what you're doing on the corporate pilot side of the house, and it's really freaking cool. On the airline side, you know, they really have to safeguard against complacency because they may go to the same place 4 times in a day, things like that. So you may be going, you know, on this one route multiple times a day, and it's a grind. You're going back to Miami and you're doing the same arrival, you're doing the exact same departure, you're going to the same area on the airport, and that can get really boring. The other thing about the corporate pilot side of the house is you're going to, in general, fly fewer legs. So the fatigue element of the flying is better depending on the company you work for. You're going to hear that on everything I say about corporate flying, depending on the company you work for. So I remember I was flying a trip at the company I work for. We flew 4 legs that day. We normally fly single pilot, but we had 2 crew at that particular day because I was doing some training on the jet, and it was just good to have an augmented crew for a bit longer day. And we were coming back from leg number 4, and the pilot that I fly with, who's our chief pilot and used to fly for a major airline, we both commented about this was his every single day at a major airline and the fatigue level he experienced at the end of that day. And this was a one-off for us as corporate pilots. So things like that you should take into account because that can really wear you out. Obviously, as an airline pilot, as you get to the top of your career, you know, maybe you're going to Amsterdam and you're sitting there for 3 days, you're coming back, and it may be a lot easier, but we're just talking in general throughout the course of the career. So I think that the variety of type of flying and the fatigue level of each day is probably better on the corporate pilot side of the house, depending on where you work. Let's talk now about your schedule and quality of life. And this is a really, really important one for me. This is my number one. So schedule and quality of life. At the airlines, like I said, it's kind of 3 on, 3 off, 4 on, 4 off forever. Corporate pilot, there is a wide range of variety. So this is where if you can find a good job on the corporate side, it is, in my opinion, much better. For example, at certain corporate pilot jobs, you may work 1 or 2 days a week and be home every night with those, and you may not be on the road much at all. That's kind of how my life is. This being in a hotel is extremely rare. This is 1 of 2 nights in a 3-month period that I will spend on the road, and it's 1 night and a very short day following. So that's pretty nice. With the airline side, you're going to be gone a lot more, and you're going to be living life on the road away from your family, and that is just the reality of it. The corporate side does have options where you can be home every night, and if that's important to you, you may want to explore this side. While the quality of life at airlines in general can be good as well, many people I've spoken to on the corporate pilot side of the house have had a much better experience and they're much happier. And these are even people that have come from large airlines and have switched over and enjoy it a lot more. But as a little bit of a side note, it really does just seem like it depends on your experience at each of these. So experiences may vary. Now we're going to talk about job options. And this is a general conversation about what's out there. So this is where my answer really may surprise you. And when young pilots talk to me and say, should I do the corporate pilot route or should I do the airline route? I always tell them to go to an airline. And the reason for that is because the corporate pilot side has a lot more variety and there are awesome options. However, you're going to have to figure out how to get into that and find that kind of unicorn job where you're going to be happy and live forever. The airline pilot side of that is just much more consistent. If you get to your 1,500 hours in general, then you get hired by a regional, then you move on to the big leagues. It's just consistent. It's a sure thing. You know what's going on there. Now, the regionals are a whole grind in and of themselves, but if you get that 121, that airline time, and you hate it after giving it a really good go, then you can always switch to the corporate pilot side of the house. If you're a corporate pilot and you hate that, going over to the airline side of the house, it's going to be harder because they generally want 121 time. You're going to have to kind of step down, maybe go to a regional, grind it out for a while, and that might be a challenge. So in general, just because of the consistency and the fact that it is a pretty good quality of life, the airline pilot side is more of kind of a sure bet. The corporate pilot side, if you can find that unicorn job, it's great. And that's why I'm over here and I love it and I'll never leave, is because of that fact. But if you work at an airline, let's say you get to your first 4,000 hours of flight time at an airline, you decide you hate it and you want to go to the corporate side, you can do that pretty easily and get hired on there. So going airline pilot first really doesn't have many downsides to it. But as someone who went the corporate pilot route first, trying to find that stay-at-home job, I love it and I'm very happy with how it worked out, and I'm never going to leave this side. I love my job, But if that hadn't happened and I hadn't found this really awesome, amazing company that I work for now, it would have been something where I probably would have regretted not going to an airline right away and just having all those options. So with all this being said, if you are a teenager that wants to get into flying and you ask me, should I be a corporate pilot or an airline pilot? My answer is going to shock you, and I will say go to an airline first, and if you hate it after giving it a solid go, I mean like 5 years, then you can go over to the corporate pilot side. Now you have 121 time, you have the ability to step into another jet on the corporate pilot side, and it's really going to be an easier transition. And because of the fact that most jobs on the corporate side are not going to compete with the pay and the quality of life and the consistency of an airline job, and it's more of a unicorn job that you can find that's going to be a great option, I would say for most people in general, the airline side might be a better choice. I hope this helps. Like I said, if you have any comments or things that I missed about pros and cons, or you just want to share your experience, put it in the comments, because not only do I read all of them, but other people on this channel read them, trying to make career decisions and see which way they should go. So if you really want to be part of helping the mission of this channel and helping the aviation community, then go ahead and put your info in the comments, whether you agree with my pros and cons, whether you agree with my answer, and what your experience has been. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, fly safely.